Evidence Not Seen, Darlene Deibler Rose. Following Pearl Harbor and the sinking of the British warships, we kept our radios turned to Manila for the newscasts. Little-known islands, mere dots in the vast Pacific, suddenly came to the attention of the whole world as the Japanese attacked, invaded, and occupied them. Guam, December 11th. Wake Island, December 23. Never fear, we were counseled. The British will stop them at Hong Kong. It's well fortified. But on our bitter Christmas day, the impregnable rock surrendered. Drunk with victory, the Japanese surged west and south onto the mainland, China, Korea, and French Indochina. In a pioneer maneuver thrusting from the southern and northern end of the Philippine Islands, the Japanese backed the defending Filipino and American forces onto the Bataan Peninsula to endure a night of horror out of which few emerged to greet the dawn of the day when peace was signed. How do you speak courage into the hearts of people when you have nothing but defeat to report? Yet every broadcast from the Manila newscaster held overtones of hope for a miracle that would turn the advancing, victorious hordes of the enemy. I can hear it now, and a lump rises in my throat. The last transmission. I'm here in our building in the center of the city. The bombs are falling all around us. Background noises of planes and explosions emphasized the statement. I'm going to have to close down. A sob interrupted his delivery. Then all of a sudden we heard him say, "Come on, America!" The awful silence that followed, pregnant with horror, left us sobbing. Yes, come on, America, dear God, have mercy. June 2nd, 1942, the Philippines had fallen. We turned our radio dials to London BBC and Sydney's ABC to keep abreast of happenings in the European war theater, as well as the Far East. With our finger on the atlas, we traced the rapid advance of the undefeated sons of Japan. They moved forward, making their onslaught on Thailand and Burma, then began the sweep down the Malay Peninsula. The Japanese were jungle fighters who never felt in the least inhibited in their military operations by the Geneva Convention for the Treatment of Prisoners. The tentacles of Japan had surfaced and had reached out in all directions, and her victims now hung limp in a stranglehold of military might. While surging forward towards Singapore's back door, Japan had begun its conquest of the Netherlands East Indies. The Dutch armed forces and the Aussies, who had slipped out of Singapore and through the naval net thrown around that island, fought bravely in Sumatra. But the odds were too great. Some escaped to Australia to fight another day. Others were incarcerated. Many died. As soon as the school year ended, Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey, Margaret, and the other single ladies had gone to Benten Tingi. They needed rest and respite from the humidity and heat of the coast. The Presswoods, Russell, and I remained in Makassar to purchase basic food supplies and other essential items that would be needed in Benten Tingi, war or no war, kerosene, lamps, wicks, and so on. I packed a few personal belongings and linens sufficient for a few months. Surely the tide must turn soon. I looked at the trunks full of very beautiful wedding gifts and pulled the door of the storeroom shut, never to see them again. We then joined the others in the mountains. 5 kilometers beyond Benten Tingi was Malino, a resort area used by Dutch and other expatriates. There was a steady influx to the area of women and children from government posts throughout the island. Patrol officers remained at their posts. Dutch police were appointed to Malino for the protection of those who sought asylum there. One by one, the islands fell to the Japanese. Sumatra, Borneo, the Lesser Sunda Islands, Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, Bhutan, and Muna. Java was under attack. We climbed to the crest of the mountain behind Benten Tingi and through binoculars saw numerous ships moving down the Makassar Straits. Distant explosions and billowing black smoke attested that a naval battle was in progress. In their battle greatcoats and camouflage, it was impossible to tell from that distance whose ships they were. Not until years later did I learn that what we saw was part of the terrible Battle of the Makassar Straits, in which so many Allied ships and men were lost. We knew it was inevitable that the island of Celebes be invaded. On a Wednesday, a Dutch policeman came to Bintentenji from Malino to inform us that they had a ship lying at anchor on the south coast. They wanted to evacuate all foreigners and all Dutch women and children who wished to go. A truck would call for us on Friday, so we should be ready. As we gathered for prayer, Dr. Jaffrey said, "I want to counsel you not to discuss this decision that must be made with each other, not even husband and wife. Go to your knees and say, 'Lord, what do you want me to do? Shall I go or shall I stay?' This is extremely vital, because then no matter what happens in the months or possibly years that lie ahead, you will know that you're exactly where God wants you to be. If He leads you to leave, you'll never feel that you were a coward and fled. If you are led to stay, no matter what happens, you can look up and say, 'Lord, you intended for me to be right here.' We earnestly sought guidance." When the truck arrived on Friday, there was not a person among us who felt led to leave. As Dr. Jaffrey had said, God does not work in confusion, a wife against a husband or vice versa, in a matter that concerns both of you. This is but a confirmation to your hearts of His directive. Some 3 days later, it was reported that the ship had been torpedoed and sunk. There were no known survivors. Then I knew why God had said, "Don't go." It is imperative that we know the voice of the shepherd and learn to follow him when he speaks. We must be obedient, no matter what he says to us. It may even mean our life. The harbor of Makassar was heavily fortified, but the enemy, having been well informed by our former barber and storekeepers, came to the back door, landing on the unprotected beach at Bolrumbong on February 8, without a shot being fired. The shock troops swept on into Makassar, killing right and left as they went. They found that everything in the city that might aid the Japanese war effort had been blown up and burned. The Dutch army had retreated into the mountains, but soon surrendered. The fear of the invaders pervaded the island. Planes strafed Malino with machine gun fire, but Bintentenji was spared. Who but those who had experienced it could really understand the apprehension of those days, waiting for the captors who would surely come? Reports filtering in were not reassuring. How would we be treated or mistreated? Were our very lives to be spilled because of the hateful whim of some enemy soldier? Would there be torture? Could we endure? With these and a multitude of other questions, we psychologically weighed our preparedness to face the unknown, a confrontation with the enemy. Always we came back to that which brought quietness. God intended for us to be here. This was His appointed place for us at this time. Connected to the Jaffrey's house by a covered walkway was a pavilion containing 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, dipper, and a kitchen. These bedrooms served as guest rooms. The Presswoods occupied one and Russell and I the other. Our first night at Bintentenji, I was awakened by an outcry and loud talking which shot me up in bed. Convinced that all the armies of the rising sun had suddenly arrived, I was covered with cold sweat. Russell then awoke and informed me that it was only Ernie Presswood talking in his sleep. "You get used to it," he admitted casually, with Ernie still moaning and babbling on the other side of the wall. When we were in Borneo, we lived with an old cook who snored something fierce. The hut we stayed in was a crude structure with no ceiling, just bare roof. Our first night there, Ernie made so much noise in his sleep that he even roused the old cook. The next morning, the old man said to me, "Tuan, bukan main. Orang itu melawan Saha. Sir, it's no joke. That man gave me competition." This afforded some comic relief to our tension. Ruth informed me the next day that Ernie had been preaching in Dayak. Echoing Russell's words, she said, "You get used to it." The conference property was not visible from the main road, but we daily heard the enemy trucks grinding their gears as they passed on the way to and from Malino. Because we were certain they would by now have noticed the lane that turned into Bintentenji, we wondered how soon it would be before the enemy came to our doors. On March 5th, while working in the garden, I was attracted by a noise in the yard and looked up to see a Japanese soldier wearing black tennis shoes with the big toes separated for climbing ropes on ships, rounding the corner of the house. The Japanese had come. The soldier pointed his gun with fixed bayonet at me, motioning me toward Miss Marsh's house. As I was being propelled reluctantly forward, Russell, the Jaffreys, and other soldiers joined me in my escort. We were herded into Miss Marsh's living room to join the Presswoods and the three single women. While we stood at attention, a soldier with a gun pointed at your back tends to make you do that, the two officers slouched in the chairs. The soldiers' uniforms were tattered and faded, their faces hidden behind unkempt, matted beards. They were filthy from who knows how many days of island hopping and marching through the jungle. Their headgear were caps with a bill in front and a flap in back to protect their necks from the sun. These were the infamous shock troops. A chill went through me. The commanding officer announced from his very relaxed position that we were prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army. Russell was standing in his customary way with his hands in front of him, the palm of one hand resting on the back of the other. It would have been impossible for him to have been holding anything in his hands, but the posture nevertheless infuriated one of the officers, who snapped a brisk command in Japanese. A soldier strode forward, raised his sheathed bayonet, and began to beat Russell's hands again and again. Russell dared not resist. I was appalled. Finally, Ernie could stand it no longer, so he said, "Russell, they want you to put your hands down at your sides." In helpless anger, I thought, "You dirty rats, if you had just said so," but Ernie knew what they wanted. For when he had first met the soldiers, he had raised his hands above his head. This infuriated the officers, and with his sheathed sword, he beat Ernie's arms unmercifully. Realizing that his gesture of surrender incensed the man, Ernie dropped his hands to his sides, and the flailing ceased. This senseless maliciousness had its desired effect. We were greatly subdued. However, Russell said later to us, "They hurt my pride more than my hands." We were asked to state our nationalities. When Margaret Kemp, Philoma Seeley, Russell, and I identified ourselves as Americans, the officer announced in a tone of voice meant to humiliate that the whole American Navy had been sunk and we were their prisoners. Then he came to Dr. Jaffrey, who replied that he was from Canada. Like the rest of us, he was terribly nervous and stuttered over his answer. The interrogator looked at him and questioned, "Canada? Where's Canada?" He obviously had never heard of Canada before, so we felt less worried for the Jaffreys and the Presswoods. Miss Marsh was from England, and apparently he had never heard of that country either. While this investigation was being conducted, Ruth Presswood tried surreptitiously to inch her way around a chair to Ernie's side. A brisk command was given, and a soldier propelled her back to her place with the butt of his gun. Finally, making preparations to go, they again impressed upon us that we were prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army. We were to have contact with no one outside the premises, nor were we to leave the conference grounds. If we did, the penalty would be very severe. We would be shot. By March 8, 1942, just 3 months from that Sunday when we listened to the news that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, the rape of the Netherlands East Indies was complete. The small Dutch army garrisoned in the islands and the tiny Dutch Navy and Air Force were helpless before the onrush of landing forces that flowed in a seemingly unending wave from Japanese transports. The days went by, tension eased, and we settled into a loose pattern of cooking, eating, Bible study, prayer, gardening, reading, and walking the perimeter of our property. I was in the house one morning when I heard a truck approaching in the distance. It stopped. The soldiers must be across the gully at Miss Marsh's house. Then it rumbled into the Jaffrey yard. Japanese soldiers and an officer entered the house. "We're taking them in," they announced. "Get some clothes together for them. No suitcases. Quickly." Alarm filled me. Running out to the pavilion, I found a pillowcase and put into it Russell's Bible, a notebook, a pen, shaving gear, clothes, and other things I thought he would need. Hurrying back into the house in search of him, I met an officer coming from Dr. Jaffrey's room. "What's wrong with that old man?" he demanded of me. There were many things, and it took quite a while to enumerate them. He had diabetes, so he had to be on a very strict sugar-free diet. He had been in a coma not too long before we had come to Bintentingji. He had kidney trouble, a heart ailment, involuntary physical shaking that affected his right hand and arm in particular, and before I could say anything more, he shut me up with a wave of his hand and snapped, "Go in and tell that old man he doesn't have to go. If he needs all that medicine, he's not going to live very long anyway." I dropped the pillowcase into a chair and ran to the door of Dr. Jaffrey's bedroom. I caught a glimpse of him putting things into his black satchel, which had belonged to his senator father. "They say you don't have to go, Dr. Jaffrey." I retrieved the pillowcase, then dashed out into the yard, my eyes searching for Russell. Where was he? What had they done to him? Then I saw him. He was already in the truck with the other POWs. He was standing in the back near the tailgate. I was terrified for him. Every unreasonable fear told me that he was being taken away to be executed. Why had the officers said that Dr. Jaffrey would die anyway? All the other separations we had endured gladly, for those had entailed the cause of Christ's kingdom. But this was different. The thought of this separation was excruciating. I handed Russell the pillowcase and looked into the face that had become so dear to me. A cry of protest, a fear strangled itself in my throat. You sadist, you didn't even let me say goodbye. I swallowed hard and clenched my fist. You'll not have the satisfaction of seeing me cry. The driver started the engine. Russell leaned over the tailgate and very quietly said, "Remember one thing, dear. God said that he would never leave us nor forsake us." The truck started with a jerk and disappeared down the road. I never saw him again.